Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith stood at the threshold of his final assignment at 62 years old, an age when most men dream of peaceful retirements. Yet there was nothing peaceful about the general's disposition. 4 decades of service to the Marine Corps had forged a man whose grandfatherly appearance belied a volcanic temper that earned him the unforgettable moniker Howlin Mad. In October 1944, destiny called upon him through a message from Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The target was set, Iwo Jima, a speck of volcanic rock in the vast Pacific that would soon become one of history's bloodiest battlegrounds. They gave it the sterile military designation Operation Detachment, but those who fought and died there would simply call it Iwo. Smith immediately summoned Major General Harry Schmidt, the commanding general of the Fifth Marine Amphibious Corps, and ordered him to begin crafting the invasion plans. Schmidt's force would comprise the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, both training in the Hawaiian Islands, which would spearhead the assault. Major General Clifton B. Cates commanded the 4th Division, while Major General Keller E. Rocky led the 5th. Meanwhile, the 3rd Marine Division under Major General Graves B. Erskine remained occupied with cleanup operations on Guam, designated as the Corps Reserve, waiting in the wings for their inevitable call to action. The strategic importance of Iwo Jima could not be overstated in the Allied campaign against the Japanese Empire. General Henry A. Hap Arnold of the Army Air Corps had grasped its significance with crystal clarity that summer. His new B-29 Superfortress bombers represented a quantum leap in aerial warfare. They could carry double the bomb load of the venerable B-17 Flying Fortresses and possessed a range exceeding 3,000 miles, compared to the B-17's 2,400. Arnold's ambition burned to unleash these mechanical thunderbirds against the Japanese home islands, but his strategic vision demanded an emergency airfield where crippled bombers could limp home from their missions over Japan. When Arnold traced a line on the map from the Marianas to Japan, it cut directly through Iwo Jima like an arrow pointing to fate. From high above, Iwo Jima resembled a misshapen pork chop floating in the Pacific's blue expanse. The island measured barely 8 square miles, stretching 5 miles in length and 2.5 miles at its widest point. It was a desolate landscape that had supported few inhabitants before the war erupted across the Pacific. From the black sand beaches to the Motoyama Plateau near the island's heart, the ground consisted of nothing but volcanic ash and cinder. Further north, the terrain transformed into a yellowish clay-like substance utterly hostile to any agricultural ambition. The island's economic backbone had been a sulfur refinery, which filled the air with a powerful, nauseating stench of rotten eggs. This characteristic odor gave the island its alternative name, Sulphur Island. The Japanese Empire had claimed Iwo Jima as its territory in 1891. The island belonged to the Nanpo Shodo chain, a string of volcanic islands that had thrust themselves from the ocean floor millennia ago. After Saipan fell to American forces, Tokyo's military planners finally awakened to Iwo Jima's critical importance and began flooding the island with troops and supplies to resist the invasion they knew must come. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a brilliant and innovative military mind, received command of this crucial outpost. Under his command stood approximately 21,000 men packed onto the tiny island. His forces included the 109th Division, the 145th Regiment, 17th Independent Mixed Regiment, 26th Tank Regiment, 2nd Mixed Brigade, the Brigade Artillery Group, plus numerous machine gun and rocket companies and naval personnel scattered across the defenses. Upon his arrival, Kuribayashi's disappointment was profound when he discovered the island's defenses existed in complete disarray. He immediately discarded conventional defensive doctrine. The traditional Banzai charges that had characterized earlier Japanese defenses were abandoned in favor of a radically different strategy. Instead, Kuribayashi ordered his men to dig tunnels, gun emplacements, observation posts, supply dumps, even hospitals, all hidden completely underground. His plan was diabolically simple yet brutally effective. Allow the assault waves to land. Let them advance inland several hundred yards. Then unleash devastating firepower from concealed positions. In the northern sector, heavy artillery was positioned in a horseshoe configuration that included 2 6-inch guns salvaged from a cruiser, 10 13mm machine guns, and 10 25mm anti-aircraft guns. This formidable emplacement earned the name Heavenly Mountain Battery. New rocket guns arrived during summer, coming in two sizes: an 8-inch round launched from a barrel that could be quickly disassembled and relocated, and a 16-inch round fired from a wooden chute. These weapons possessed ranges of 2,000 and 3,000 yards respectively, adding another layer to the island's deadly defensive network. July 1944 saw the placement of 6 additional 75mm mountain guns around Hill 362A in the northwest section, accompanied by several 47mm cannon positioned throughout the area. Sniper holes, machine guns, and automatic weapons were cunningly situated in the caves, gullies, ravines, and gorges that scarred Iwo's northern landscape, creating overlapping fields of fire that would exact a terrible toll. At Kitano Point, the extreme northern tip of the island, Kuribayashi established his headquarters in what amounted to an engineering masterpiece. A labyrinth of tunnels extended 500 feet in every direction, while his planning and strategy rooms sat buried 75 feet underground. The only structure visible above ground was the communication blockhouse, measuring 150 feet long and 70 feet wide. Its walls and ceiling constructed from reinforced concrete 5 to 10 feet thick. A fortress within a fortress. Near the island center, the Japanese erected another communication center designed to coordinate and control all artillery fire across the island. On the plateau, additional artillery and field pieces stood ready to rake the beaches where the Marines would make their landing. In total, an astounding 26 miles of interconnected passageways honeycombed beneath Iwo Jima's surface, creating an underground fortress of unprecedented scale. At Iwo Jima's southern end loomed the 554-foot-high dormant volcano known as Mount Suribachi. This natural fortress bristled with every weapon in the enemy's arsenal and contained 7 stories of caves and tunnels. These subterranean chambers were braced with any available material that could be confiscated: logs, driftwood, even parts of damaged aircraft. Near the volcano, Korean laborers could endure only 15 minutes of work at a time due to the relentless heat and suffocating sulfur fumes. Many compartments boasted electricity, water, and numerous entrances designed to provide escape routes from the flamethrowers the Marines would inevitably employ. Cave openings were angled at 90 degrees to further frustrate attackers, while all living quarters were vented to allow the sulfur fumes and steam to dissipate into the atmosphere. Every acre of Iwo Jima had been methodically transformed into a killing zone of nightmarish efficiency. By early February 1945, Iwo's fortifications neared completion. As the invasion date approached, Kuribayashi understood with grim clarity that despite his formidable defenses, victory remained impossible. He was determined, however, to exact a terrible price in American blood for every yard of Japanese soil the Marines seized. The defenders would make the attackers pay dearly for their conquest. The naval and marine forces assembled for the invasion represented a scale unprecedented in the Pacific campaign. Nearly 800 warships would participate in the operation, including 8 battleships, 12 aircraft carriers, 19 cruisers, 44 destroyers, plus transports, LST's landing ship, tank, LSM's landing ship, mechanized and cargo and auxiliary vessels of every description. The Marine contingent numbered over 70,000 men, and when combined with Navy and U.S. Army personnel, the invasion force swelled to over 100,000 troops, a massive concentration of military power aimed at a tiny volcanic island. Strategic planning for Iwo Jima's conquest proceeded smoothly until October 24, 1944, when a serious disagreement erupted between the Marine Corps and Navy concerning pre-invasion bombardment. Schmidt requested 10 days of naval bombardment using 3 battleships and assorted cruisers. This request traveled up the chain of command to Admiral Richmond K. Turner, commander of Task Force 51, who promptly denied it. Turner argued that a prolonged shelling would sacrifice the element of surprise, limiting the bombardment to just 3 days. This reasoning bordered on the absurd. The Japanese knew perfectly well that a massive invasion force was steaming toward Iwo Jima, and surprise had long since evaporated. On November 8, 1944, another request was submitted, this time asking for 9 days of bombardment. It too was rejected. The original plan calling for 3 days would stand firm. The Navy's actual motivation became clear: Task Force 58 was planning to attack Japan during the Iwo campaign, primarily to counter the publicity the Army Air Force's B-29s were receiving. The Navy wanted to demonstrate that its carrier-based planes could match the heavily publicized bombers in striking power and effectiveness. Howlin Mad Smith was furious at this decision. He refused to let inter-service rivalry cause unnecessary hardships for his men. He took the argument directly to Admiral Raymond Espruance, the overall commander of the operation, requesting just 4 days of bombardment. Once again, he was turned down. Smith was heartbroken by the decision. He could not erase the memory of hundreds of Marine bodies floating in the lagoon at Tarawa in November 1943, men who had died, in his opinion, needlessly because naval gunfire had failed to neutralize enemy defenses as promised. Years later, distinguished Marine historian Colonel Robert Heinel would write that canceling the additional shelling of Iwo Jima represented a costly irony. The Marines would have to make do with 3 days of bombardment and pay the price in blood. Schmidt selected the eastern beaches as the landing sites after careful deliberation. The western approaches had been discussed and initially approved, but the Navy objected to the surf conditions on that side of the island. The Marines reluctantly agreed, even though this decision gave the Japanese excellent fields of fire on the landing craft that would carry the assault troops to shore. Each landing zone was divided into 500-yard sections, totaling 3,000 yards of beach frontage. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division would land on Green Beach nearest Mount Suribachi. Adjacent to them on Red 1 and 2, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division would hit the beach and drive toward Motoyama Airfield No. 1. On Yellow 1 and 2, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division would right and strike at Motoyama Airfield No. 2. Finally, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 25th Marines, 4th Marine Division would take a sharp right turn after landing and move against the quarry. The remaining battalions and the 3rd Marine Division would be held in reserve, waiting for the call to reinforce the assault. As the assault team steamed toward their objective, Admiral William R.P. Blandy and his Task Force 52 had already commenced the 3-day preliminary bombing of Iwo Jima. Simultaneously, just 60 miles off the coast of Japan, Admiral Mark Mitcher's task force was launching carrier strikes against the home islands. Blandy's armada of 6 battleships and 5 cruisers began its careful, methodical firing at predetermined targets. At day's end, the fleet withdrew to sea with disappointing results. Overcast skies had proved detrimental to accurate shelling, and many shells had fallen wide of their marks. The following morning, the UDT's underwater demolition teams went into action, beginning their dangerous work. The frogmen faced the perilous task of removing any mines or other obstructions that might hinder the landing. LCI's landing craft, infantry, had been outfitted with 20mm and 40mm cannon to provide covering fire for the UDT teams. As these small, courageous vessels approached the shore, the Japanese opened fire with devastating effect. After dropping off the frogmen, the tiny boats zigzagged frantically trying to avoid enemy gunners. Of the 12 ships involved in this operation, all were struck by artillery, with 9 completely destroyed. When the smoke cleared, 43 men lay dead and 109 wounded from the LCIs, plus another 7 killed and 33 wounded from one of the destroyers. The second day of bombardment ended with the beaches declared suitable for landing, but the Japanese had drawn first blood in a savage preview of what awaited. On the final day of bombardment, the primary targets were the base of Suribachi and the artillery protecting the avenues of approach. From 7:45 in the morning until 6:30 that evening, the big guns blasted the tiny island relentlessly. The Navy was optimistic at day's end, estimating they had destroyed or damaged half of Iwo's fortifications. The northern area, however, had been barely touched, a fact that would cost many Marine lives in the days ahead. Admiral Blandy radioed Admiral Turner to report that his mission was complete, adding that another day of bombing would be fruitless. The Navy had completed its job to its own satisfaction. Now the terrible burden shifted to the Marines, who would pay in blood for every inadequacy in the preliminary bombardment. Dawn on Monday, February 19, 1945, witnessed the murky, gray skies over Iwo Jima transform into an azure blue canvas. Marines stood on the decks of various transports combat loaded with weapons and equipment, waiting to board their landing craft. The temperature was a pleasant 70 degrees. The the sea remained relatively calm, and a slight breeze provided relief. It was ironically a perfect day for an invasion, beautiful weather for dying. At 6:40 in the morning, the pre-hour bombardment commenced with thunderous fury. 5 battleships on the east coast and 2 on the west fired 75 rounds each in 80 minutes. Iwo Jima rocked from the concussions of the 16-inch salvos that pounded its volcanic soil. 4 heavy cruisers and 3 light cruisers hurled 100 rounds of 8-inch shells, while destroyers added their 5-inch rounds to the cacophony of destruction. Although the bombardment created an awesome spectacle, many veterans from previous campaigns knew with grim certainty that the Japanese would be waiting, largely unscathed in their underground fortresses. As they prepared to climb over the gunnels into the waiting landing craft, the chaplain asked for a moment of silence and recited the 23rd Psalm. As they started their descent, Corpsman Greg Emery, attached to the 28th Marines, wished the chaplain had chosen something more uplifting. The passage about the Valley of Death struck too close to home, filling him with foreboding. Other Marines prepared to make the assault in LVT's amphibious tractors. As they climbed down narrow metal ladders below deck, the Navy coxswains who would guide the vessels to shore started the engines. Soon, the hold of each ship filled with the sickening smell of exhaust fumes that made many men nauseous even before they reached the battle. The line of departure was established several miles offshore. Shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning, an airstrike composed of 120 carrier planes soared overhead in 2 precise columns, dropping napalm on their first run. The jellied gasoline mixture erupted in massive explosions, creating great billowing clouds of fire and intense heat that brought loud cheers from the watching Marines. The aircraft soon returned with orders to scrape their bellies on the beach, as they pounded the sandy coastline with strafing runs and rocket fire. When the fighters finished their work, the fleet resumed its bombardment. In total, the Navy fired over 8,000 rounds at Iwo Jima, an impressive number that would prove tragically insufficient. Just past 8:30 in the morning, the main control ship dropped her pennant, signaling the final approach. LCIs armed with rockets were followed closely by 68 LVTs mounted with 75mm howitzers. The vessels began their mad dash toward the beachhead in long, orderly waves. The rocket boats launched 20,000 projectiles in a spectacular display, then swerved right and left to allow the amphibious tractors clear passage to the beach. Just before 9 o'clock, naval gunners began zeroing in their weapons on inland targets in a rolling barrage designed to keep Japanese defenders pinned down. When that bombardment lifted, more fighters roared in, dropping their deadly loads and peeling off over the sea. At 8:59 in the morning, the first Marine touched ground on Red Beach 1. Americans had set foot on Japanese soil for the first time in the war. In rapid succession, the remaining waves churned ashore and headed for the wave-cut terraces that loomed ahead like natural ramparts. These terraces, 3 in total and one right after another, had been created by severe storms several years earlier that had pushed the loose volcanic ash into 10 to 15-foot piles. They stretched from the shore to the plateau where Airfield No. 1 was located, creating a natural obstacle course. Infantrymen quickly discovered how exhausting it was to maneuver in the volcanic ash. Private First Class Fred Volchak, a mortarman from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, found himself exhausted from carrying the excessive weight of his weapon and extra rounds. As he sank ankle-deep in the loose soil with every step, he muttered repeatedly to himself, "This ash, this ash." His frustration echoed the sentiments of thousands of Marines struggling through the unforgiving terrain. Enemy activity during the first half-hour ashore had been surprisingly light. An occasional mortar round and some sporadic automatic weapons fire had been the extent of the resistance. That deceptive calm, however, was about to shatter into violent chaos. Suddenly, the Japanese sprung their trap with devastating precision. They had allowed the Marines to become crowded on the beaches before unleashing their carefully planned attack. From atop Suribachi and from the north, artillery and mortars cascaded down on the packed Marines. Making any type of tactical maneuver became impossible. There simply wasn't any room to move. The only course of action was to push forward through the storm of steel. According to one participant who survived the carnage, front lines? There aren't any front lines. This whole island is a front line. By late morning, Company B of the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines had fought their way to the western beaches and successfully cut off Suribachi from the rest of the island. Without tank or artillery support, it became a battle of individual Marines armed with nothing but rifles, grenades, flamethrowers, and satchel charges. Pillboxes that had been eliminated suddenly came alive again, shooting at advancing Marines from behind. Kuribayashi's underground defenses were working with terrible perfection, inflicting numerous casualties on the attackers. Lieutenant Frank Wright, a platoon commander with Company B, had started the day with 60 men under his command. By noon, only 2 remained alive and unwounded. Captain Dwayne Mears fell with a serious throat wound, but still urged his men forward with his dying breath. Corporal William Faulkner of Company C counted himself among the lucky ones when he was flung backward into a bomb crater after a shell exploded in front of him. A piece of shrapnel dented his helmet, but somehow he escaped serious injury, a miracle amid the carnage. Conditions on the beach deteriorated rapidly. The Japanese concentrated a great portion of their ordnance on trucks, jeeps, LVTs, tractors, and amphibious vehicles, creating a graveyard of twisted metal. The lifeless bodies of Marines and sailors floated aimlessly in the surf, adding to the horrific congestion and making movement even more difficult. Howitzers and tanks were desperately attempting to get ashore. A massive effort was underway to clear paths for equipment to move inland and support the hard-pressed assault companies. The 31st Seabees, attached to the 5th Marine Division, managed to get the first bulldozer ashore at noon. Its operator, Seaman First Class Ben Massey, was quickly shot in the neck. Machinist mate Hollis Cash immediately jumped into the seat and began operating the machine, pushing forward despite the deadly fire. Cranes and caterpillars were utilized to dislodge vehicles mired in the wet volcanic ash. Navy beachmasters shouted frantic orders into their bullhorns as enemy shells continued to explode among them with horrifying regularity. Machinist mate First Class Alpinix Bernard's LSM ran aground on the wet sand. As the ramp dropped, he prepared to get his caterpillar off as quickly as possible. He was the first one to leave the craft, followed closely by tanks and bulldozers. As he lurched forward, he noticed the bodies of the dead lying in front of the boat. Not able to bear looking at them, he clenched his teeth and drove over the corpses, the treads crushing them beneath. He kept telling himself desperately that he had to get ashore and level the terraces so the tanks could push ahead. The mission had to come first, even if it meant desecrating the dead. Meanwhile, the 4th Marine Division sector faced even worse conditions. The 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines occupied the worst position on the entire beachhead. They landed near the ridge that was closest to the beach from the north, immediately coming under devastating fire. If I knew the name of the man on the extreme right of the right-hand squad of the right-hand company of 325ths, I'd recommend him for a medal before we go in, Major General Clifton B. Cates had said before the landing, recognizing the deadly position that unit would face. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 25th Marines struggled desperately to reach the ridge and cliff area. But as with all movement on Iwo, progress was agonizingly slow. To their south, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 23rd Marines ran into formidable Japanese defenses protecting the 1st airfield. Sergeant Darrell Cole of the 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines demonstrated extraordinary courage by sneaking around one pillbox and slipping grenades through the apertures. He crawled back to his lines and acquired more grenades, returning to the concrete structure to repeat his attack when an enemy grenade landed nearby, killing him instantly. He would be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his selfless valor. The bloodshed on D-Day was appalling beyond description. Kuribayashi had executed his plan with deadly precision. Let the Marines land, allow them to move inland about 500 yards, then unleash his artillery with devastating effect. Due to the large caliber of the guns, most bodies were horribly mangled. Heads, arms, legs, and other human remains were scattered over large areas. Enemy shrapnel disemboweled one Marine, his entrails pinkish in color and looking like a giant earthworm in the black ash. One company, while supposedly in reserve, suffered 30 casualties. There was no safe haven anywhere on that accursed island. One individual was lying prone on the beach when a shell burrowed beneath him. The resulting explosion heaved him 50 feet into the air. He landed with a sickening thud, and his crumpled body lay motionless on the blood-soaked sand. Somewhere on Red Beach 1, lying face down in the sand, was the body of Gunnery Sergeant John Basiloni of the 1st Battalion, 27th Marines. Basiloni had been awarded the Medal of Honor on Guadalcanal and was pulled from action to participate in war bond drives across America. The soft duty did not appeal to the tough New Jersey native, and he had petitioned persistently to be returned to a line company. He got his wish and was killed in action on Iwo Jima during the first day. He would be posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, becoming one of the few men to receive both of America's highest decorations for valor. Medical personnel were taxed beyond their limits. Corpsmen and doctors alike were not spared the enemy's guns. In one nightmarish area, 2 doctors and 16 corpsmen were killed in a single artillery barrage. Another medical detachment landed with a complement of 26 men and by day's end had lost 11, nearly half their strength. The first night on Iwo Jima was described by Time Life correspondent Robert Sherritt as a nightmare in hell. The illumination shells fired from the destroyers created a surrealistic effect on the battlefield, casting eerie shadows across the volcanic landscape. To one exhausted Marine, Iwo looked like another planet, an alien world of death and destruction. Major General Clifton Cates wished desperately for another 6 hours of daylight, or even 4. Hell, he thought to himself in frustration, I'd compromise for 2. He was deeply worried about the 14th Marines, his artillery regiment that had not yet landed. Fortunately, the 75mm and 105mm cannon managed to get ashore by dusk. The 13th Marines, the artillery arm of the 5th Division, had also landed some of their pieces. Both units would be desperately needed in the morning when the attack resumed. Steaming toward Iwo Jima through the darkness were the 9th and 21st Regiments of the 3rd Division. The 3rd Regiment would soon follow. Nearly 30,000 troops were now ashore, with more arriving every hour. An incredible 50,000 men were crammed onto an island measuring a mere 8 square miles, a concentration of humanity unprecedented in modern warfare. The banzai charge that Howlin Mad Smith had hoped for did not materialize. Kuribayashi was too cunning for such wasteful tactics. Instead, he sent out wolf packs, small squads of 2 and 3 men to harass the weary Marines throughout the long night. An enemy thrust containing nearly 40 soldiers was destroyed by elements of the 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, as it attempted to infiltrate toward Kitano Point. Later that evening, Yellow and Blue beaches were closed because enemy artillery fire had increased dramatically in intensity. The steady, raucous shriek of the 675-pound spigot mortar shells could be heard as they traveled overhead in lazy arcs. Most Marines eyed the strange weapon with morbid curiosity, as each shell left a trail of red flame behind it. Fortunately, it proved not very accurate, but the remainder of the Japanese arsenal continued its devastating work. Colonel Harry the Horse Liversedge, commander of the 28th Marines, sat hunched over his maps in a shell hole, preparing the following day's assault. As he scanned the charts by flashlight, he realized grimly that it would not be easy for his troops to seize Suribachi, but taking that commanding height was essential to assist those units advancing northward. Ironically, the man from Volcano, California, was going after a volcano in the morning, a fact that would have seemed humorous under different circumstances. Dawn on February 20th, 1945, arrived cool, cloudy, and thoroughly miserable. All units were poised for the attack after a long, sleepless night. The 26th and 27th Marines were ready to move up the west coast, while on their right flank, the 23rd, 24th, and 25th Regiments prepared to advance up the east coast in coordinated movements. To the south, surrounding Suribachi like besiegers at a medieval castle, was the 28th Marines. They faced the daunting task of penetrating 1,300 yards of pillboxes, tunnels, bunkers, blockhouses, anti-tank ditches, machine gun emplacements, and mortar pits, a nightmare of defensive positions. Just prior to jumping off, carrier planes strafed and bombed Suribachi's base in preparation for the ground assault. Rounds from the 13th Marines and additional firepower from the mine-layer Thomas E. Fraser were added to the preparatory bombardment. At 8:30 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson's 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, started moving methodically toward Suribachi. To their right advanced Lieutenant Colonel Charles Shepard's 3rd Battalion, 28th Marines. The base of the mountain was encircled with broken, jagged rocks and sparse areas of underbrush. Skirting the foundation was a green edging that contained the majority of the enemy's weapons in carefully concealed positions. The sharp crack of 5-inch shells from the destroyers could be heard as they drilled over 1,500 rounds into the mountainside, some landing as close as 200 yards to the Marine lines. Demolitions and flamethrowers became the vanguard for the assault as the 2nd Battalion alone blasted shut over 40 caves. By late morning, the 3rd Battalion, 13th Marines moved their 37mm half-tracks and 75mm howitzers closer to the infantry for more accurate fire support. Johnson fired off a frustrated message to division headquarters. Enemy defenses much greater than expected. There was a pillbox every 10 feet. Support given was fine, but did not destroy many pillboxes or caves. Groups had to take them step by step, suffering severe casualties. His words captured the grinding, bloody nature of the fight. As the 5th Division slugged its way closer to Suribachi, the 4th Division was experiencing equally hard fighting. Many officers became casualties in the fierce combat. The 2nd Battalion, 25th Marines, lost its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis C. Hudson, Jr., its executive officer, Major William P. Kempfer, and its operations officer, Major Donald K. Ellis, when a mortar round made a direct hit on their command post. A half-dozen corpsmen from the 1st Battalion, 25th Marines, were killed outright by a single artillery shell. The same round severely wounded 7 others. Enemy fire spared no one, regardless of rank or position. Despite the fierce shelling, the 23rd Marines took the first airfield by early afternoon, assisted by 4th Division tanks that rumbled across the open ground. The 28th Marines, however, had advanced only 200 yards against Suribachi. The going was treacherous, time-consuming, and profoundly discouraging. Kuribayashi transmitted a final message to his men defending the mountain. First, one must defend Iwo Jima to the bitter end. Second, one must blast enemy weapons and men. Third, one must kill every single enemy soldier with rifle and sword attacks. Fourth, one must discharge each bullet to its mark. Fifth, one must, even if he be the last man, continue to harass the enemy by guerrilla tactics. This was the last message sent to Suribachi. Marines from the 5th Engineer Battalion uncovered a cable 1.5 inches thick running from the mountain to the north and quickly severed it with cutting tools. The enemy inside the mountain fortress was now truly isolated, cut off from reinforcement and resupply. At day's end, the Marines controlled roughly 1/4 of the island, a modest gain purchased with terrible casualties. The 5th Division had lost another 1,000 men, and the 4th Division suffered 2,000 dead and wounded. Secretary of the Navy James V. Forrestal was aboard the flagship El Dorado to observe the battle firsthand. The horrendous suffering and carnage left him speechless, unable to comprehend the scale of destruction. LST-779 wedged its way through the wrecked remains littering Red Beach 1 and delivered the first of the V Amphibious Corps 155mm howitzers. By late afternoon, 4 of these big guns were ashore and ready to pound Suribachi with their devastating shells. During the night, star shells filled the inky blackness, transforming night into an eerie artificial day. The tiny island trembled from the force of artillery blasts. Near the eastern side of the mountain, a number of enemy soldiers were congregating in what appeared to be preparation for a banzai charge. The destroyer Henry A. Wiley silently slipped to within 200 yards of shore and saturated the area with her 5-inch rounds, breaking up the attack before it could begin. It was another long, tense night on Iwo. February 21st dawned cloudy on Iwo Jima. The thunderous roar from the howitzers of the 13th Marines and shells from the naval vessels offshore hammered the mountain relentlessly. The bombardment fell precariously close to the assault troops, who were pelted with flying rocks, earth, and other debris. Liversedge wanted the fire to be danger close. "Ask for all of it, Pete," he told his operations officer, Major Oscar Petrus. "And tell those planes to drop it close. We can't use air tomorrow." As the aircraft peeled off after their bombing runs, a ghostly silence fell upon the lines. For a brief moment nothing happened, then 1 Marine, then 2, then 3, followed by clusters of determined men, stood up and began walking toward their objective. All along the 700-yard line, Marines began to zigzag forward to avoid the increasing enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson Butterfield's 1st Battalion, 28th Marines, moved along the western beaches, while Lieutenant Colonel Charles E. Shepard's 3rd Battalion hurled itself at the center of the volcano's fortifications. On the eastern side, Johnson's 2nd Battalion met stubborn resistance that slowed their advance. Casualties began to multiply rapidly. The cry of "Corpsman" could be heard above the din of battle throughout the day. Corporal Richard Wheeler of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines had his jaw broken by a piece of shrapnel. The same mortar round also wounded another Marine sharing his shell hole. While pharmacist mate 3rd Class Clifford Langley tended to their wounds, another mortar round burst directly in their position. This time, Wheeler sustained a severe leg laceration as metal fragments sliced through his calf muscle. The other Marine now lay on his stomach, stripped of skin and bleeding heavily. Langley ignored his own wounds and kept working frantically on both men. As he laboredo saved their lives, another mortar round landed among them. Wheeler and Langley watched in horror as the projectile burrowed itself into the loose ash. To their profound relief, it failed to detonate, a miracle that saved all 3 lives. The fighting around Suribachi intensified with each passing hour. Marines carrying the Browning automatic rifle performed a leapfrog action. One would fire while moving forward as the other reloaded, allowing them to inch their way closer to the mountain through coordinated fire and movement. Private 1st Class Daniel Friday of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines demonstrated extraordinary courage by running to the front of a tank to guide it after the communication phone was shot from another Marine's hand. The Arapaho Indian from Wyoming stood exposed in the open and steered the Sherman tank using hand and arm signals. As a direct result of his bravery, the tank's 75mm gun delivered accurate fire that destroyed several pillboxes that had been holding up the advance. By day's end, the 28th Marines had reached the very foot of Suribachi. The riflemen had blasted shut hundreds of caves and neutralized numerous pillboxes and other defensive structures in brutal close-quarters combat. To the north, the fighting proved equally gruesome and costly. The 4th Division was running headlong into Kuribayashi's main line of defense, a wall of interconnected fortifications. By nightfall, the 21st Marines of the 3rd Division received orders to come ashore. They assembled near Airfield No. 1, preparing to attack in the morning and add their weight to the assault. During the night, Condition Red was suddenly sounded as kamikazes from Japan struck at the fleet. The USS Saratoga was hit by suicide planes. The aircraft carrier managed to stay afloat despite being struck by 6 planes in rapid succession, though she was badly damaged. Not so lucky was the escort carrier USS Bismarck C. One kamikaze hit triggered a catastrophic explosion that destroyed the fire mains and rendered the plane elevator useless. Airplanes fueled on the flight deck were soon engulfed in flames. Ammunition began to cook off in secondary explosions, and the order was finally given to abandon ship. Over 200 men lost their lives as the carrier slipped beneath the waves. February 22nd arrived as a wretched day on Iwo. The rain turned heavier, transforming the volcanic ash into a slurry mixture that clung to everything. The thick mess wreaked havoc with weapons, causing rifles and machine guns to jam at critical moments. The fighting resumed with renewed intensity, and the all-too-familiar sounds of the wounded crying out, the roar of artillery fire, and the whoosh of flamethrowers permeated the sulfur-laden air. As the infantrymen pressed forward yard by bloody yard, grenades flew at them from cave openings, and many fought the enemy at point-blank range. No artillery or air support could be given to them because they had closed to such proximity with the mountain that any supporting fires would kill friend and foe alike. Major General Keller Rocky came ashore and established his division headquarters in a shell hole near Airfield No. 1. As he and his staff pored over charts and maps, planning the next day's operations, the dull drone of bulldozers could be heard in the distance preparing the 5th Division cemetery. Men from Graves Registration, clad in rubber aprons and wearing gloves that reached to their armpits, were assigned the ghoulish task of gathering the dead. In some horrific cases, only an arm or a head could be found among the scattered remains. Bodies were piled in rows while their final resting places were being dug. Nearby were stacked thousands of white crosses that would soon adorn the graves of the fallen. With Suribachi finally surrounded on all sides, all that remained was to climb to the summit and secure it. The constant bombardment, however, had obliterated all established paths to the top. With nightfall approaching, Liversedge halted all combat operations until morning, when the Marines would begin their final assault on the volcano and attempt to plant the flag on its summit. Inside the mountain, Approximately 300 Japanese soldiers were all that remained of the once formidable fighting force. Half the group attempted to escape and rejoin other units in the north during the night, while the remainder chose to remain and die fighting in the dark abyss of Suribachi, preferring death to surrender. There was a slight overcast on Friday, February 23rd, D+4. The rain had stopped and sunlight appeared through the clouds like a blessing. Suribachi was strangely silent after days of thunderous combat. The fortifications that ringed the volcano were now abandoned, with the Japanese soldiers having retreated to positions near the top to make their final stand. The mountain bore the terrible effects of the tremendous shelling it had endured. Its scarred slopes revealed the twisted wreckage of the huge naval guns that had been in place there. The tunnels, most of which were now empty of defenders, were still smoldering from flamethrower attacks. A meeting was held to discuss the course of action for securing the summit. Colonel Liversedge and I went to the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines Command Post and talked with its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, his executive officer Major Tom Pierce, and his operations officer, Captain Martin Reinman, recalled 28th Marines Operations Officer Major Oscar Petrus years later. We emphasized the need to let the rest of the troops know that the mountain had been secured. Consequently, we talked about smoke pots and other methods and finally decided on Colonel Johnson's idea of taking a flag up and raising it on the spot where it could be seen over the entire island. The most logical route to the summit was determined to be on the northeast side, so Johnson selected Company E for the historic mission. He informed Captain Dave Severance, the company commander, who chose the 3rd Platoon to make the climb, to be led by his executive officer, 1st Lieutenant Harold Schreier. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning, Schreier's 40-man patrol started its climb to the top of Suribachi, making history with every step. Schreier ordered riflemen positioned on each side of the column to protect their flanks from any remaining enemy. The extra gear the Marines were carrying slowed their progress, and they stopped for brief rests on their way to the crest. Certain steep areas had to be ascended on hands and knees, the men pulling each other up. "Those guys ought to be getting flight pay," remarked one observer watching from below. Schreier's patrol reached the summit at 10 o'clock in the morning. The climb had proved surprisingly uneventful. No shots had been fired at them. Everyone peered apprehensively about the crater, but no enemy soldiers were immediately visible. Schreier gestured for the patrol to take up defensive positions on the outer rim. One Marine, in a show of defiance and relief, urinated over the edge. Still nothing happened, and eerie silence prevailed. As half the patrol covered the edge of the mountain, scanning for threats, the remainder moved toward the center of the crater. A brief firefight ensued when a Japanese soldier was spotted at one of the cave openings and was quickly eliminated. As this was happening, 6 Marines tied the American flag that Johnson had handed them prior to their ascent to a length of drainage pipe they had found. At 10:20 in the morning, the flag was hoisted high into the Pacific breeze. This was the first Japanese home territory seized by American troops in World War II. Staff Sergeant Louis Lowry from Leatherneck magazine snapped a photograph of this historic moment. But this image would be largely forgotten when Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal took his now famous picture of a second, larger flag raising hours later. To the exhausted Marines scattered across Iwo Jima, however, photographs meant nothing in that moment. All they knew was that Suribachi had been captured, and they would not have to worry about their rear while they moved northward against the remaining defenses. When the news spread across the island, the beachhead erupted into a tumultuous roar of bells, whistles, and foghorns, a celebration of the first victory. A wounded Marine, lying on the deck of a hospital ship offshore, tried desperately to lift himself up to get a better view of the flag flying from Suribachi summit. He was too weak from his wounds to shout with joy. He slumped back down on his cot and wept openly, overcome with emotion. To the north, the battle had devolved into a bloody stalemate. Gains were minimal as approximately 1,000 Marines were falling, dead and wounded, every single day in the grinding combat. The bitterest fighting was taking place around Airfield No. 2, where Japanese defenses proved particularly formidable. Shells from the battleship USS Idaho and the cruiser USS Pensacola hammered the center of the island in preparation for renewed assaults. Gates complained bitterly about the naval ordnance not adequately destroying the defenses, and he requested that U.S. Army heavy bombers stationed in the Marianas provide additional support. At 9:30 in the morning on February 24th, The 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 21st Marines jumped off to seize the airstrip. The enemy had positioned over 800 pillboxes surrounding the field, an almost incomprehensible density of fortifications. Companies I and K started running across the runway, led by 1st Lieutenant Raoul Archambault, in a desperate charge. Marines made it to the ridge beyond the airfield and began a seesaw action to hold the hard-won position. In the wild fighting, they fell on Colonel Masuo Ikeda's men with rocks, rifle butts, bayonets, knives, pistols, and shovels, wrote historian Richard F. Newcomb in his book about Iwo Jima. In 90 minutes it was over. Archambault and his men were on top of the ridge. The advance had covered 800 yards, and the line was breached. Through the gap poured tanks, bazooka men, mortarmen, and machine gunners, cleaning up as they advanced. On the east coast, the 24th and 25th Marines moved closer to the airfield by occupying Charlie Dog Ridge. By the end of Day 6, the 9th Marines received orders to land and join the fight. Over 1,600 Americans were now dead and 4,500 were wounded, but only one-third of the island was in Marine hands. Only the 3rd Marines remained in reserve. The well was running dry. The end of February saw the 26th and 27th Marines engaged in bloody fighting on the west coast. They faced one ridge after another as they endured vicious crossfire from multiple directions. The 9th and 21st Marines were confronting Hills Peter and Obo, while the 23rd, 24th, and 25th Marines were ready to strike at Hill 382, the second highest elevation on Iwo. Hill 382 was a nightmarish maze of pillboxes and bunkers. Its crest had been excavated and fitted with artillery pieces and gun pits that commanded the surrounding terrain. To the right of this position stood the Turkey Knob, a small rise strip completely of foliage. In addition to the usual fortifications, a huge blockhouse that also served as an observation post and communication center was located there. 85 rounds from a 75mm howitzer failed to put even a dent in its thick walls. Next came Minami. Originally a small village, it had been transformed into a nest of interconnected bunkers. Completing this defensive ring was the amphitheater, an open bowl-shaped depression 300 yards long and 200 yards wide. From the tops of these positions, the enemy threw grenades and satchel charges down on attacking Marines with deadly accuracy. Armored bulldozers tried desperately to clear away rocks and debris so tanks could maneuver through and assist the infantry. Advances were measured in feet rather than yards in some places. The area was soon dubbed the Meat Grinder, a name that perfectly captured its terrible nature. All 9 battalions of the 4th Division hurled themselves at the Meat Grinder in coordinated attacks. By nightfall on February 27th, they had the area encircled. The cost, however, was staggering, nearly 800 casualties in a single day. Erskine wanted desperately to bring his 3rd Marines into the fight, but Howlin Mad Smith disagreed. The island, he argued, was too congested with troops. It was congested everywhere except where it mattered most, the front lines, which remained desperately undermanned. On March 1st, the 28th Marines, which had been resting in reserve after securing Suribachi, swung back into action against Hill 362A on the west coast. Marines from the 1st and 2nd Battalions reached the top after fierce fighting, but were confronted with an 80-foot cliff on the far side that made further advance impossible. Also lying ahead was Nishi Ridge, an open area the Japanese had covered with interlocking fields of fire from all sides. All the approaches were studded with caves, spider holes, and small niches that concealed riflemen and automatic weapons. Company C of the 5th Tank Battalion supported the advance. Flamethrower tanks proved helpful in burning out defenders, but the terrain was so impassable that only 350 yards were gained despite a full day of fighting. The attack resumed on March 2nd across all fronts. The 3rd Division assaulted Hill 362B in the center of the island. In one particularly difficult area, dubbed Cushman's Pocket after Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cushman, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, the Marines had an extremely tough time. They finally secured it after days of fighting, but spent the next 2 weeks mopping up bypassed positions. Hill 382 was finally taken by the 2nd Battalion, 24th Marines after sustained attacks. Artillery and air power had pulverized the amphitheater and the Turkey Knob into rubble. Over a ton of demolitions were used as combat engineers methodically closed tunnels and caves. The Meat Grinder, however, had taken its terrible toll. over 3,000 casualties from the 4th Division alone. With the 26th Marines on the right flank and the 28th Marines on the left, the 5th Division continued operations on the western side of the island. The 21st Marines and 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines maneuvered around the flanks of Hill 362A to assault Nishi Ridge. 4 separate tunnel systems were uncovered during the advance, one reaching over 1,000 feet in length and having 7 different entrances. Tanks had great difficulty maneuvering around a stretch of anti-tank ditches in a draw, but managed to blast their way through to reach the hard-pressed rifle companies. The Marines found themselves fighting in the midst of natural rock formations where the enemy had built fewer concrete structures, relying instead on nature to provide cover. It was just a maze of tunnels and caves, wrote First Sergeant John Daskalakis of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. It was very easy to lose sight of each other. The soil at the northern end of the island was clay-like, grayish in color, almost like a marltite. The Japanese were underneath you and behind you. Men were shot in the back. They had command posts, hospitals, and ammunition dumps underground. You couldn't see them. It reminded me of the Devil's Den at Gettysburg. While the Marines were grinding their way northward, a damaged B-29 limped into Iwo Jima, making the sacrifice worthwhile. As the aircraft made a bumpy landing, a few mortar rounds thumped behind her as she touched down. Marines and Seabees greeted the crew members with enthusiastic slaps on the back, living proof of why they were fighting. Soon after the aircraft was repaired, the superfortress was winging its way back to Guam. Before war's end, over 2,000 B-29s would make emergency landings on Iwo Jima, with over 24,000 crewmen saved as a direct result. They had the Marines to thank for their lives. As the days passed in a blur of violence, the Marines slugged it out with the remaining Japanese defenders. Only 80 prisoners had been taken so far in the entire battle. Of these, 45 were Korean laborers. The enemy was not surrendering. They were fighting to the death. Many Marines would stop and stare at the few survivors, fascinated. It was the first time many of them had actually seen a living Japanese soldier up close. Marines of the 4th Division repelled the only organized banzai attack on Iwo Jima, when 1,000 of the enemy charged their lines in a final desperate assault. Machine gun and rifle fire mowed down the human waves with devastating efficiency. Some of the attackers armed with nothing but bamboo spears. When it was over, 784 bodies were counted on the battlefield. The Marines lost 90 killed and almost 300 wounded. But the attack signaled the end of organized resistance on the east coast of the island. Kitano Point was the last stronghold of the Japanese defenders. Just before the attack against it commenced, 75mm and 105mm howitzers of the 13th Marines and the 155mm cannon of the Corps artillery let loose over 22,000 rounds in a devastating barrage. 8-inch shells from the cruisers also aided in softening up the western side of Iwo. The attack moved ahead until the infantry was halted near the high ground that ran southeast from Kitano Point. The 28th Marines found themselves looking down into a deep gorge. It was the worst terrain on the entire island, a hellish landscape of rocks and ravines. They called it Death Valley. Heavy weapons were useless in such narrow and hilly ground, so the 75mm and 37mm guns were brought forward to provide direct fire support. The 28th Marines edged their way up the gradual slope toward a key position that commanded all approaches to the north. They were ordered to hold their ground while the 27th Marines swung around from the west. The 26th Marines would also join the assault and converge on the final enemy stronghold in a coordinated attack. By now, the Marine divisions were decimated shadows of their former strength. Companies were now platoon-sized and in some cases led by corporals rather than officers. Nerves were strained to the breaking point. Casualties kept streaming into the field hospitals with wounds that make you sick to look at. Artillerymen, cooks, and clerks were now being sent to the front lines to reinforce the exhausted infantrymen who could barely stand. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders at the start of the battle, a mere 1,500 remained alive. Kuribayashi sent his last dispatch to Tokyo, which read in part, "The situation is now on the brink of the last moment. I shall lead the final offensive, praying that our empire will eventually emerge victorious. Bullets are gone and water exhausted. We are ready for the final act." That evening he ordered the colors of the 145th Infantry Regiment burned so they would not fall into enemy hands. On Wednesday, March 14th in 1945, the official flag-raising ceremony was conducted in the southern part of Iwo Jima. As Colonel Davis H. Stafford read the proclamation declaring American control, the dull sound of gunfire could still be heard in the distance. A team of stretcher-bearers carried a wounded Marine past the ceremony to a field hospital, and nearby a 105mm cannon roared. The battle was still very much in evidence. The war was not yet finished. A hushed silence fell over the assembled crowd as Colors was played. The flag was hoisted atop an 80-foot pole as the one on Suribachi was simultaneously lowered. When the ceremony was completed, very little was said among the group of survivors. Misty-eyed, Howlin Mad, Smith said simply, "This was the toughest yet." 2 days later, the island was declared officially secured by High Command. The Marines still fighting in Death Valley were stunned by the announcement. They would spend another 10 days in that godforsaken gorge fighting a stubborn foe who refused to acknowledge defeat. In the early morning hours of March 26, the Japanese on Iwo Jima staged their last desperate assault. Hundreds of them formed up near Airfield No. 3 and quietly crept along a trail heading south under cover of darkness. Reaching the tent area that housed the 5th Pioneer Battalion and Army Air Force personnel, they attacked with savage fury. Caught completely by surprise, these units were overrun in just a few minutes. Airmen had their throats cut while they slept in their cots. First Lieutenant Harry Martin of the 5th Pioneers organized a hasty counterattack, rescued 2 men from certain death, and was twice wounded before being killed. He was posthumously awarded a Medal of Honor. It was the last one given in the campaign. In total, 27 Medals of Honor were presented for actions on Iwo Jima, the most for any single battle in Marine Corps history. By morning it was over. Over 250 enemy bodies were counted on the ground, and another 18 were taken prisoner. The Pioneers lost 9 killed and 31 wounded. 44 airmen were slaughtered and 88 wounded. Rumors were rampant that Kuribayashi himself had led the raid, but his body was never recovered from the carnage. Soon, the U.S. Army's 147th Infantry assumed garrison duty on Iwo Jima, relieving the exhausted Marines. Japanese stragglers were captured long after the battle was officially over. Some survived by scavenging discarded food and by drinking their own urine to stay alive in the caves. Only 1,083 enemy soldiers survived the battle. The Marine losses were staggering beyond comprehension. 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded, plus 2,648 cases of combat fatigue. The words of Chaplain Roland B. Gittleson stand as a fitting memorial to those who paid the supreme sacrifice on that volcanic island. Thus do we memorialize those who, having ceased living with us, now live within us. Thus do we consecrate ourselves, the living, to carry on the struggle they began. Too much blood has gone into this soil for us to let it lie barren. Too much pain and heartache have fertilized the earth on which we stand. We here solemnly swear, this shall not be in vain. Out of this, and from the suffering and sorrow of those who mourn this, will come, we promise, the birth of a new freedom for the sons of men everywhere. The battle for Iwo Jima stands as one of the bloodiest campaigns in Marine Corps history. Every inch of that volcanic rock was purchased with American blood. The strategic importance of the island was proven beyond doubt. Those B-29 crews who landed safely on its airstrips owed their lives to the Marines who died taking it. The sacrifice was not in vain, but the cost was almost too terrible to comprehend. The names of the fallen are inscribed forever in the annals of American military history, their courage and sacrifice ensuring that freedom would prevail over tyranny in the Pacific.